Two things define you: your patience when you have nothing, and your attitude when you have everything.
The impact of working hours on health has just been released. Conducted by the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization, they reviewed data from 194 countries, looking particularly at heart disease and stroke. They found that around 500 million people each year are exposed to long working hours, with nearly 800,000 deaths attributable to that, and millions of years of healthy life lost to disability due to heart attacks and strokes. And our region may be one of the worst affected. Lead author of the research, Dr. Frank Peka, is an epidemiologist and technical officer with the World Health Organization's Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. And he joins us from Geneva. Welcome to the Health Report, Frank.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
Before you did this study, what was known about the link between work and heart disease?
We always knew that from the evidence, from the literature, that there is a strong link between working long hours and having heart disease and stroke. That was clear, but we didn't know the extent to which that was the case.
So you tell me what you did in this study to expand the knowledge.
In the study, we basically quantified how much health loss we do have from working long hours, and that here means working 55 hours or more. We conducted a huge set of systematic reviews and meta-analyses where we pooled all the available studies together. These were a large number of cohort studies conducted across the world to basically arrive at the exact increased risk for people working long hours to have a deadly heart disease or stroke. And then we combined this information of increased risk with a huge database, a United Nations database that has data in it for 154 countries, never used before, several 100 million data points in it on the proportion of people working long hours. And then when we combined this, we have a mathematical formula to calculate how many people can actually be attributed to have died from exactly this exposure to long working hours.
Long working hours defined as what?
Long working hours here really means working 55 hours or more per week on average. And that is in line with a number of epidemiological studies that have divided working long hours up in this way. And that's normally the highest category.
And what did you find, and how did it compare to other occupational risks? Because I would have thought that injury would have beaten heart disease and stroke.
Right, exactly. This is what common knowledge was at this point. But with this study, I would almost dare to call it, it's a game changer in the sense that we now know that long working hours actually have a larger attributable burden than any other occupational risk factor, including the one that you mentioned. So we now know that this is basically the most deadly and largest occupational risk factor that has ever been quantified by the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization.
Now, this can get quite complicated because Michael Marmot in London has shown that he talks about job strain, that it's not just the number of hours you work, it's the job that you do. And it's quite possible that people who work long hours in jobs where they've got a lot of control, where they're not getting chronically stressed, are okay. So there's two questions here. One is, how sure are you that it's cause and effect? And is it job specific, or anybody working over 55 hours is at risk?
Right. Okay, we're very well familiar with Professor Sir Michael Marmot's work on job strain, and this is, of course, very closely related to our work here. So we worked with about 60 professors from around the world that looked at the evidence for a period of 5 years, synthesized also what we call mechanistic evidence. So what are the actual pathways through which we know that long working hours impacts health and impacts stroke and ischemic heart disease? And there are two causal pathways that are theorized that actually are aligned with the work of Professor Marmot and others. One is a direct pathway. So we know, and many of us will know this who have worked long hours, we know that when we work long hours, there's psychological stress and physical stress that is exerted. There's a direct pathway between working long hours and then having stress responses that damage tissue in the heart and in the brain and can therefore lead to heart disease and stroke. There's also an indirect pathway whereby people who work long hours may also be engaging in more health detrimental behaviors. And one of these is smoking, but also sleep, right? Sleep deprivation. We know that people working long hours sleep more poorly, and this is in turn a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and stroke. So when the scientists evaluated these 60 professors from around the world, what the strength of evidence was for a causal relationship between working long hours and these two health outcomes, they rated it as sufficient evidence for harmfulness, which is the highest rating that can be given in terms of strength of evidence.
So I suppose my question is a plastic surgeon earning a couple of $1 million a year, working 60 hours a week, filming, operating lists and everything else, going to be at the same risk as a labourer in poverty in Southeast Asia working more than 55 hours a week?
Right. So the second part of your previous question that relates to, so do jobs make a difference? So in occupational epidemiology, we divide the world into occupations. People can have different occupations and work at different industrial sectors. And for all of our meta-analyses, we conducted what is called subgroup analyses. So we looked at risk broken down with the data by occupations, by different occupations such as, you call them labor or manager, for example, and also by industrial sector. And surprisingly, we found no difference or no evidence for a difference at this point from the available evidence that we have, right? So in other words, the construction worker, the manager, the teacher, there was no difference to be found in the available evidence at the global level that there are differences in risk.
And presumably you controlled for smoking and other unhealthy behaviours so that it was an independent factor.
We did control for all of the variables that we could that are normally controlled in these studies to basically isolate as much as possible the causal effect of working long hours on stroke and on ischemic heart disease. Correct.
We know that unemployment is very bad for your health as well. Is there a sweet spot in terms of working hours that are good for your health?
That's another question. There might indeed be a health benefit from working, a certain lower number of hours, but that does not seem to be the case from what we've seen. But we haven't done a systematic review that looks at sort of underwork, right, as opposed to overwork. So people working less than standard hours. Standard hours we defined, according to legislation, as 35 to 40 hours per week. So it might be that there is a negative or positive health effect from working less than these standard hours. You're quite right, but this was not what our study looked at.
Fascinating. Frank Pager, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Frank Pager works at the World Health Organization in Geneva.